My guest today is not Giles Macdongh. I hope I said that right. Sorry if I didn't.
McDonough, yeah.
But yes, and of course, today we're going to talk about a rather, I would say, peculiar king of Bavaria, King Ludwig II, known as the Swan King. And of course, as always, how did you get into this peculiar king, as I'm said?
How did I get into this peculiar
How,
king? Well, I'm actually more a historian of Prussia
hmm,
than Bavaria. But last year I did 3 lecture tours in Bavaria, so I'm fairly up to date with King Ludwig. That's. But essentially, I'm a historian of Germany and Austria, and that is how I get to know Ludwig. And Ludwig has to interact, much to Ludwig's unhappiness, with the Prussian kings and that sort of thing. And his mother was a Prussian princess, which is not to be forgotten.
hmm. So of course, that's because most people like myself, and we talked about this before we started recording, is probably mostly familiar with Germany after Bismarck this time. So, but it wasn't a unified, and we talked about this on the podcast before, that it wasn't a unified kingdom. It was much like, I would say, Italy at the time. It was several smaller kingdoms, and as you mentioned before the podcast, it was Bavaria wasn't actually created until Napoleon. So let's talk about the creation of Bavaria first before we go into Ludwig II.
Oh, but Bavaria existed and had existed um, uh, since it became a Christian entity in what the 8th century. The Bavarians managed to fight off at the famous Battle of Lerchenfeld in 755. They fought off the heathen Hungarians. And from that moment onwards, Bavaria was established with its own dukes. So it was a very old principality, dukedom, which the Wittelsbach, a particular family, had ruled since 1186, I think it was. So the Wittelsbachs are a very old dynasty in Germany, who had ruled in their part of South Germany since the end of the 12th century, and continued to rule there until 1918, when they were packed off. So the Wittelsbachs themselves considered themselves to be, behind the Habsburgs, the most important dynasty in Germany. Now, some German areas had become kingdoms in the 18th century and the late 17th, early 18th century. So Saxony, for example, Hanover, and eventually Prussia in 701 became kingdoms, subservient to the emperor in Vienna, but kingdoms. Now, Bavaria didn't get that honor until 1806, and that was largely because they'd been siding with the French during the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1806, Bavaria became a kingdom too. But the Wittelsbachs were intermarried with the Habsburgs, being Catholics, which is something the Prussians wouldn't obviously have done, or the Hanoverians, and because they were intermarried with the Habsburgs, they saw themselves very much as a family that could replace the Habsburgs. And when the Habsburgs ran out of boys, of male children, in 1740, the Wittelsbachs, the rulers of Bavaria, tried to take over the empire. And one of their electors, that is the ruling princes, became very, very briefly, I think for 2 years, Holy Roman Emperor, until he was chased away and replaced by the husband of a Habsburg princess. And then the Habsburgs become Habsburg Lorraines because the two families were united like that. But that branch of the Habsburgs, of the Wittelsbachs, died out in 1788. There were no more Wittelsbachs in that line. So there was a little war, the War of the Bavarian Succession. And when that ended, a minor branch of the Wittelsbachs from Zweibrücken took over in Munich and became the electors, that is to say, the ruling princes. And that branch it was that was made kings in 1806. And it was from that branch that our subject subject today, Ludwig of Bavaria, came. So he didn't come from the main branch because that had died out.
So let's talk about the upbringing of Ludwig, and we will come back into this later about the Bourbons. But let's talk about Ludwig's upbringing and education.
Well, Ludwig was born the son of King Max, who was had this. He was, he was the prince, the son of Ludwig I, so he was going to become king. So Max was a prince, the crown prince, if you like, and therefore little Ludwig, lived in the residence, that is the big palace in the center of Munich, and was brought up there. And he was also brought up in Hohenschwangau, which was a little yellow castle, which still exists, right next to the famous palace of that Ludwig built. There he was brought up with pictures of German legends, particularly Bavarian legends of Lohengrin and Tannhäuser and that sort of thing. All these legends that were vaguely Bavarian, vaguely Franconian, that were later to form subject matter for Richard Wagner, the man who that Ludwig honored beyond all people on earth. So as a little boy, he grew up in a palace and a country house decorated with pictures of knights. And later on, as he got older, Wagner would write music about this, because there was no real connection between this, but this was the romantic folklore which inspired the little Ludwig as he was growing up both in Munich and in Hohenschwangau. So that was an important side of his early education. Now, he didn't have a huge amount of time for his father, Max, but he had less time, in a way, for his mother, because his mother, Princess Maria, was a Prussian. And all his life, Ludwig rather rejected this side of his nature, that his mother, who was a formerly Protestant princess, the Wittelsbach obviously being Catholic, a formerly Protestant princess who obviously had to agree to become Catholic to marry the future king of Bavaria, he's thought of her in a slightly unhappy way, that she represented the traditions of Prussia, which had become a much more powerful country, almost as if it had overtaken the Wittelsbachs, which made the romantic Ludwig unhappy about his mother's birth and the fact that he had his mother's blood. But of course, on that side of his family, the Hohenzollern side, the Prussian side of his family, there was lots of romanticism too. That that Maria's cousin was Friedrich Wilhelm IV, King of Prussia, who restored all these castles on the Rhine. And Friedrich Wilhelm IV had built lots of buildings through his court architect Schinkel, who was the most famous architect of the time. And it was Friedrich Wilhelm IV who decided that they were going to finish building Cologne Cathedral, which was intended to be the largest cathedral in Europe in the Middle Ages. But at the end of the Middle Ages, it remained unfinished, with just the choir and certain parts of the front of the cathedral had been built. So from the 1840s onwards, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who was the uncle, essentially, or the great uncle, I think the uncle of little Ludwig, started rebuilding Cologne Cathedral and constructing the edifice that we can still see today, which is this enormous Gothic cathedral finished in the 19th century as part of a national project for reviving Gothic architecture in Germany. So there were plenty of precedents on this side. And then on the other side that he got from the Prussian side, Ludwig inherited, obviously, the blood, not quite the blood because he had no children, but the blood of the family of Frederick the Great, who was a famous king in the 18th century, who fought obviously against the Catholic Bavarians and that sort of thing, who built these wonderful buildings like Sanssouci in their Rococo style, and who also, strangely enough, was a rather embittered homosexual man. And this is what Ludwig himself was going to become in his way. So it begs an obvious question: how much of the Prussian side actually was in Ludwig, something that he rejected himself, but which in many ways he resembled some of his mother's family.
Hmm. And we talked about this as well, of course. He would, and we talked about this off the record, and that he was had more romantic side, that he wished to be more tied to the Bourbons dynasty of France as well. But that's more like a romantic dream, as we discussed before the
Yes,
recording.
but there even in the architecture there are two sides. If you take Schwanstein, Gothic, and each one of these great builds, very interesting way that he does that. But he wants a castle in each different sort. He wants one of these, one of these, one of these. So when he builds Hohenchiemsee, for example, it is a Bourbon Schloss that is meant to look like Versailles. So that is his Versailles imitation. But in other buildings, he uses a Rococo style, which is very much like Sans Souci was to Frederick the Great of Prussia. So he's got a collection of buildings in all sorts of different styles. Some of them were never built. And there was one that was going to be built that was completely Byzantine in its inspiration. So you see different inspirations with different styles of architecture in each one of the palaces. He's not fixed on one particular style. He wants his tribute to the Bourbon because the Bourbon represent to him not only what he sees as his family, but he also sees it as a sort of monarchy, which is an absolute monarchy, which he wants for himself, because he doesn't want to be a constitutional monarch. He finds the idea of being a constitutional monarch something quite disgusting. He doesn't want anything to do with it. Yet, after 1848 and the revolution in Bavaria, Bavaria was a constitutional monarchy. It was something he couldn't do anything about. And his final tendency in the last 10 or 15 years of his life was to go and hide himself in the hills and in his different constructions and that sort of thing, because he didn't want anything to do with the rather disgusting side of being a monarch by the grace of the people, which didn't appeal to him at all.
Hmm. And something else that I found fascinating about him was that he did I do believe he liked dressing up as well.
Yes, I think he did. He liked sort of dressing up. He liked reciting poetry with other favorite boys around him, and reciting poetry, dressing up, reenacting the legends of Bavaria, the Tannhäuser legends and this sort of thing, Parsifal. And so he enjoyed all that, and reading plays and acting things out. That very much appealed to him.
Hmm. And if I remember correctly, he would keep doing this until late, not just as a kid, but throughout his life as well.
Yes, throughout his life, he used to enlist actors from the court theatres to come and act with him and read to him. He was a very impatient figure, and he put these people through a terrible time when they were with him, because I suppose he was probably, as we would say today, bipolar. So, it wasn't just that he, through depression, went in and out of stability, mental stability, and rather more instability by the end, is that he replaced night with day. So he was only really up in the evening. And anybody who was employed to come and read to him or do that sort of thing had to adopt his hours, which meant that they were up all night and only went to bed in the morning.
Mm. Of course, let's talk about his succession to the throne. And like we established earlier on, he never was close to his father or his mother. But even he admitted that because he became king at early age, at age 18. So
Yes.
he stated himself that he felt like he became king too soon.
Yes, he probably did become king too soon. Although I wonder if it would have made any difference in the long run. He became king as you say, at the age of 18, very quickly the political events in Germany brought about a sort of crisis in his understanding of his role. For a start, as I said, he was a constitutional monarch. There was a parliament in Bavaria, wasn't something he was terribly keen on. But at first, he played the game. He went out, he saw his troops, he went to Munich, he lived in Munich, he had rooms designed, new rooms designed that would be part of his fantasy within the enormous city palace in Munich. But in 1866, the Bruderkrieg broke out, the War of the Brothers, the civil war in Germany, which was essentially to see which of the two main powers within Germany, Prussia or Austria, was going to essentially lead the German states in the future. And as we all know, this war was won by the Prussians, which meant that essentially almost immediately a North German Confederation was formed in 1866 under the Prussians, which meant the whole of North Germany essentially became Prussian. And that Bavaria, although it remained outside this Prussian North Germany, the role of Austria was forever eliminated within the German lands. So from that point onwards, it was almost inevitable that Bavaria would have to play second fiddle to Prussia. And then just 4 years later, with the Franco-Prussian War, or better still, Franco-German War, Bismarck slightly encouraged a misunderstanding between Prussia and France, which, of course, made the emperor of France, Napoleon III, believe he had a chance to go in and collect a few states on the left bank of the Rhine, and fell into the trap of believing that he was going to win a war against Germany, which he promptly lost. And this, of course, provoked a much greater crisis with Ludwig, because he had to, for the sake of his people, who were quite keen on this war against France, he was very pro-French, I might add, and visited Paris several times in the 1860s, that Ludwig would have to agree to having Bavaria playing second fiddle to Prussia and honoring the King of Prussia, who became the German emperor in 1871. Now, Ludwig agreed to this and wrote the famous Kaiser brief, or the emperor's letter, where he gave his brother the permission to arrive at the court of Versailles and show the letter, which meant that Bavaria would allow the Prussian king to become German emperor. But behind the scenes, Bismarck, who actually quite liked Ludwig and thought he was quite a good person, probably for many, many different reasons, but Bismarck was never unkind about Ludwig. Bismarck, of course, had made off in 1866 with the treasury of Hanover, which he used as what he was called the Guelfenfonds. This was a sum of money which could be used politically. And with this Guelfenfonds, he was able to give money to the always hard up Ludwig in order to carry out his architectural projects. So that he essentially bought Ludwig off by giving him a very large amount of money every year for the rest of his life.
Did Bismarck feel like he should exploit Ludwig in a sense?
I think so, in a little way. I mean, the fact that that Ludwig played ball with Bismarck obviously made Bismarck like him all the more. But Bismarck was never rude about him in the way that some people were, never sort of exploited it too much. He was well behaved in what he was doing. And he knew, of course, that Ludwig was going to incur enormous debts. Part of the problem there was Ludwig's grandfather, who had been deposed as king in 1848 and had this extravagant Irish mistress called Lola Montez, that Ludwig I was the man who created the beauties of Munich as they existed before the Second World War, was a great builder and architect and lover of the arts, And Ludwig adored his grandfather for obvious reasons. This was the sort of king that Ludwig wanted to be himself, like his grandfather, with lots of money in the treasury to spend on building magnificent buildings. Now, of course, in 1848, Ludwig I was deposed because he'd spent so much money and that sort of thing. It didn't go down particularly well with the people in Munich. And until 1869, King Ludwig II had to keep King Ludwig I and pay his bills and that sort of thing. So he had no money to spend on building palaces until his grandfather died. So, this was useful in 1870. Just as soon as he more or less got his feet under the table, that Bismarck came along and gave him this bribe, which allowed him to start building. And it was at precisely the time when he got a bit more money, because he was no longer paying for his grandfather.
So let's talk about his engagement and his sexual orientations. When he got married, until he got married to his wife.
He got into. He was very. He got on very well with his cousins, Elizabeth Sissy, as she's known. And she was the daughter of the Duke in Bavaria, and they were another branch of the Bavarian royal family that become estranged from the main branch. So, being his cousin, they lived on the other side of the Starnberger See, so very close to one of the palaces which he lived in with his family when he was growing up. And so he used to enjoy seeing his cousin and riding with her and that sort of thing. And she eventually married Franz Josef, the Emperor of Austria. She had a younger sister, and so she was destined to become Ludwig's wife. She liked Wagner as well, and they enjoyed reading the same sort of books. And I suppose at that stage that Ludwig was going to, again, play ball. He was going to do what he had to do, and that is take a wife. But at the last moment, he couldn't face it, because his inclination was homosexual. He had no desire to have any sexual relations with a woman. This is to some degree speculation, but it is clearly, obviously the case that he couldn't face the marriage, and he broke off the engagement. He was never engaged to anybody else, and nobody else was ever mentioned ever again. And from that point of view, there was a diary which he kept, which was destroyed in the Second World War, in which he spelled out his sexual relations with people at court and that sort of thing, often servants in the, at court who would essentially agree to go to bed with him or whatever they did. But that diary was destroyed in the war, as I said. But before then, the main excerpts of the diaries had been copied out and published. So we do have that evidence that he had these sexual relationships with men, and that he suffered because he was actually quite a religious man. He prayed every night before he went to bed, I think for an hour or so. And therefore, he believed what he was doing was sinful. And so the diaries are full of lamentations that he is actually doing something wrong in having sexual relations with these men. So that is clear, but he could not face a conventional sexual relationship with a woman that would bring about children that would be his heirs. And that didn't happen. Of course, he had his younger brother, Otto, who went properly mad. Sometimes people try to say that Ludwig was not mad, but Otto was definitely certifiably mad. So these two children of King Max were both, in their way, not only unstable, but to some extent insane.
How would you describe Ludwig as being mad? Was it because of his vast building projects, or was there anything else? That we can see. We mentioned he was bipolar, but was there anything else?
Well, lots of people now say that that he wasn't mad in the sense that people in the 19th century would say he was mad. But then our definitions of madness are probably more gentle than the definitions of 19th century people. So we probably wouldn't see depression as madness. We certainly wouldn't anymore. And it's possible that all that Ludwig was really suffering from was extreme bouts of depression that got worse as he got older. And I think that's the case. I'm no psychiatrist, but I think that, as you get older, these things do get worse. Nowadays, we treat these things with drugs, which treat the imbalance of chemicals in the blood, so that people can cope with depression. In those days, nobody knew how to cope with that depression. People like Bismarck didn't think he was mad, for example. There is another example of Bismarck being quite sensitive to him. So not everybody thought he was mad. But certainly his actions were difficult to understand for people who were either impatient with him or wanted a conventional monarch to be ruling in Bavaria.
Now, let's talk about, because we talked about this, he was a builder and he wanted to build like his grandfather. So we talked about some of it, but let's talk more about his enormous building project. And he even had one building, I don't remember the name of the castle, but that castle that would put him in enormous steps that would never be finished in his lifetime. And put Bavarian severe debts until he joined Germany, basically.
Yeah. Well, the building projects took off, as I say, as soon as his grandfather died, and he had a bit more money in the kitty. So they were started to some extent simultaneously, because he had in his mind he wanted one like this, as I said earlier, one like this, one like this, one like this. The earliest building projects took place in the residence in Munich. He built a huge winter garden on the top floor of one wing of the residence, which then leaked and destroyed the rooms underneath. So that wasn't a particularly successful episode. After the bombing of Munich, they restored the residence, but they didn't rebuild the apartments that had been lived in by Ludwig II. So the furniture, such as it is, you can find at Hohenchiemsee. The most famous one, obviously, is Neuschwanstein, which was this enormous Gothic building, partially modelled on Pierrefonds, Chateau Pierrefonds in France, which he'd seen, and the architecture of Viollet-le-Duc, but there were other important elements in that too. And that was definitely unfinished at the time of his death. And the other completely unfinished building that he did was a most astonishing project. It was Hohenchiemsee. It's an island in the middle of the lake near Prien in Bavaria, where he tried to reproduce Versailles in all its forms. And so essentially, the place looked like Versailles. I think it was actually slightly bigger than Versailles. And yet Versailles had been constructed by Louis XIV so that he could keep his entire nobility under his nose so they couldn't plot against him. Whereas Ludwig built this idea of this enormous chateau so he could get away from his nobility, and he was going to live in it all by himself. And the only one of these projects that ever completely came to fruition, and I'm looking for the name of the slightly smaller house near Oberammergau, which I can go look up in a moment, is that was the little Rococo house, but it was far too narrow in its conception, and therefore the rooms are tiny for all the stuff that he's put in them. So as a result, it feels a little bit cramped there. Whereas all the other ones, of course, have got massive amounts of space in them and that sort of thing. So that side of the building, that none of these things was ever going to be finished. But he played a very important role in the building. And I think until I saw Neuschwanstein, for example, which I was slightly dreading, until I saw Neuschwanstein, I thought it just looks, of course, like that Disney castle, which is very largely modelled on it. And yes, it can look a bit raw from close up. It's essentially theatre architecture. He used a lot of theatre architects to build his projects. But when you go and you look at the furnishings and the wallpaper and the paintings and the individual paintings and every single detail in every single room is worked out to the smallest square inch. And Ludwig participated in the planning of that furniture, in the choosing of the fabrics, in the choosing of the colors, in the depictions and the scenes. He said, I want it like this. And if it didn't go like that, just like his grandfather, he said, no, 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 you've got to start again. I don't want it like that. I want it like this. So every single piece of furniture, every single painting was personally inspected and approved by Ludwig. Now, this had some sort of effect on Munich and Bavaria in general as a center of culture and craft in Germany after Ludwig's death, because it was Munich that became the city of the arts in Germany at the end of the 19th century under the Prince Regent, but largely because Ludwig had so got all the workshops working in Munich in order to provide a craftsman who could do the work for his different Schlösser. So Ludwig, from that point of view, inspired a whole generation, if not two generations, of craftsmen in Bavaria. And it's not for nothing that Bavaria was the place where people went to art school around the turn of the century. It was the development of very many modern movements in art and culture because the foundations had been laid by, yes, by the grandfather as well, but particularly by Ludwig in developing all this furniture design, the Gobelin, the tapestries, and that sort of thing, which had been very much encouraged by Ludwig when he was king.
I might be wrong here, and probably am, but didn't the Nazis use the castle as well as art collecting during the Second World War, if I'm not too mistaken?
What they used, what they filled them. You may be right. There was plenty of room to put all sorts of things. I mean, if you go to Hohenchiemsee, only a few of the rooms are actually decorated. The other things are completely empty. So one wing of Hohenchiemsee was pulled down at the beginning of the 20th century because it was so expensive to keep up. But in fact, the castles have paid their way because only a few days after Ludwig's death, they were actually open to the public for the first time. And it was only a matter of a few years before tourists and people coming to look at these astonishing creations had actually paid the bills for the castles because they paid their entrance charges and everything else. So ironically, it was this public, this sort of dirty working class public, if you like, that paved the way for the castles in the end, the people who Ludwig himself would not have wanted to see tramping around the rooms of his castle.
Something that we haven't talked about is that he did like to travel as well throughout his kingdom, and how was he received by his people during his travels in Bavaria?
Yes, absolutely. He loved to ride around, particularly at night, in his carriages, to ride his horse, but ride around the carriage, and would appear in the oddest places up in the mountains in Upper Bavaria. And the people would see him, they'd see their king. And up there in Upper Bavaria in particular, I think much more so than, say, in Munich, where they probably had a rather more different attitude. But up there in Upper Bavaria, they had a great fondness for their king. In Oberammergau, for example, he was one of the people who made the play, which is put on every 10 years, was on last year. He made it popular and attended a performance. He and three other people saw this massive play take place over 6 hours and gave the little town of Oberammergau a great big crucifix, which they still treasure to this day. So in Upper Bavaria in particular, he was very, very highly honored and loved as this figure of their king, who they might walk into at any time, or see his carriage coming by late at night or in the middle of the night or something like that. So he became a very much associated with a sort of romantic figure who might pop up any moment. But as I say, he didn't tend to travel around in his carriage around Franconia. He wasn't much seen in Lower Bavaria, and he certainly wasn't seen in Munich after a certain amount of time. You know, he stopped going to Munich. Went there as little as possible. When laws had to be signed, as they had to be signed by the king, somebody had to do the business of going and finding the king and staying up late into the night for that moment that he'd allotted to sign the latest laws that have come from the parliament in Munich.
Something we haven't talked, we talked a little bit about this when it said that Bavaria, not Germany, would play a second fiddle to Prussia, but let's talk about Bavaria's role a little bit more in the North German Federation.
Well, there was a great reluctance to join it, but of course the Bavarian parliament was composed of elements that were, as I said before, relatively sophisticated. There were the Ultramontanes, which were the Catholics, who wanted to Ultramontanes across the mountains, meaning that they looked to the Pope in Rome. Now, although Ludwig was Catholic, he didn't believe that he should be subservient to the Pope. That would not have been his idea. So from that point of view, he didn't really agree with the Ultramontanes. And then for the more liberal members of the Bavarian parliament, again, he wasn't happy with this idea of constitutional monarchy. So as he grew older, less and less did the idea of observing the desires of a constitutional monarchy appeal to him. Now, the people who wanted the constitutional monarchy tended to be nationalists. So the idea of a national Germany as one united Germany appealed to them, and they were likely to defend the idea, particularly after the victorious wars of Bismarck. In 1864, Bismarck had pushed Austria out through the after the Franco-Danish War. 1866 was the decider, which meant that most of North Germany then essentially became under the power of Prussia. And then 1870, you know, the ball was rolling down the hill, gathering moss as it went down. And by 1870, when Germany defeated, under Prussian leadership, defeated the old enemy France and extracted huge indemnities out of the French in 1871, it was impossible to resist the idea of merging all the old principalities and kingdoms of Germany into one united Germany. But it wasn't really united Germany in the sense that, less so than Italy, for example, in that the old kingdoms still remained old kingdoms, that the princes still had their palaces and lived in their palaces and were still princes. Bavaria managed to win an exceptional status. It had its own army, it had its own post office, it had its own ministers, in a way that the other parts of Germany that had been similarly important until 1871 didn't have the same power that Bavaria had. Bavaria became the free state. It was different in its status to the rest of Germany. That much Ludwig was able to secure, but it was impossible to argue that Bavaria was really a completely free spirit. It wasn't independent of Germany, and therefore, as such, it couldn't be pretended that the kings of Bavaria had come out of it with the same power that they had had before. You know, the Wittelsbachs would play second fiddle to the Hohenzollerns, which was something that Ludwig particularly disliked.
Now, was there jealousy among the other princes in Germany and the North German Federation that Bavaria had such power and they were basically, they did not have as much power as Bavaria did?
I don't think there was a particularly audible noise made by other German states. The state that was treated worst by Bismarck were the Hanovers. And as I said, that Bismarck stole the contents of the treasury in order to use it for bribing people for political ends. And the Hanovers were more or less deposed, which of course caused slight problems with Britain, because Hanover, the British monarchy, the Georges, and indeed Queen Victoria, had come from the Hanoverian family. So the behavior towards Hanover caused a certain amount of problems with relations between the new Germany and with Britain. And this, obviously, it's a different subject, but this survived, obviously, all the way down to 1914. This feeling that the Hohenzollerns had mishandled, had been unfair towards what was formerly a cousin territory, which was Hanover. So apart from Hanover, I can't really see there was a particular, a few glitches with Saxony, but nothing really to the degree that it was experienced in Bavaria. I think probably because Bavaria had, in the 18th century, been so close to taking over the Holy Roman Empire themselves. The Prussians couldn't, by dint of being Protestant, they couldn't have done it anyhow. They couldn't have married into the Habsburg family because they were Catholics. So Bavaria did see itself as next in line. And so, and still that attitude to some extent is something that reigns in Bavaria now. If you meet Bavarian noblemen, they tend to give you very much this version of their history.
So let's talk about it, because it was a coup d'etat attempt, if you will, against Ludwig II, as well, to dethrone him, if I remember correctly.
Who tried to dethrone him?
So according to my sources, there were attempts. I might be wrong. It might be the earlier Ludwig I'm referring to here, but let's talk about, ignore that one for a second, and just let's talk about towards the end of Ludwig's life, and up to
yes. Well, I mean, there were growing problems.
First World War.
Yeah. So there were growing problems of debt. Essentially, his income did not meet his outgoings, and so there wasn't nearly enough money to pay for all his fantasies and all his the things that he required to build these things. So that led to borrowing. And of course, first of all, you borrowed from banks, and then you had to borrow from other banks, and then you had to go and borrow from British banks, because the British banks were the richest banks in Europe at the time. And eventually, when these people didn't get their money back, they foreclosed on him. So, it became very, very difficult to satisfy, to have the material needed to pay, to stock these castles, to furnish these castles, because Ludwig couldn't borrow any more money. So the choice of courtiers that he employed was he'd sack somebody and bring somebody else in, because they said that they could find some way of getting the money. So everything became a desperate desire to have money. Meanwhile, there was the embarrassment in Munich that the king didn't show himself in Munich, was not particularly popular with his people in Munich. And then all he did was be a drain on the exchequer, which would bring you essentially to Wagner, who became the most glaring example of Ludwig's desire to spend money, and money that he didn't necessarily have. Sorry. So the Wagner case was also something that rather proved the popularity of Ludwig in the broader terms, but also showed that there was a growing resentment against Ludwig at home, because Wagner did very, very little to endear himself to the Bavarian people while he was wooing their king. So this became a little cause célèbre, we might call it, was the business of what to do about Wagner.
There's something I want to talk about as well, is there's a problem with succession of Ludwig II. As we talked about, he was a homosexual, and
yes,
the problem he probably killed, but he did not want to father children or take a bride, which caused a problem in heirs for the throne.
Mm.
So how was this going to be solved with the succession of the throne to Ludwig II?
Well, he had an uncle, and that uncle took over after his death and became Prince Regent. Now, it was often said that it was said that this man had connived at trying to have Ludwig uh, step down, abdicate as king, because he wanted the job for himself. Now, there are still people who say that this is the case, but it doesn't really look as if that is the case. The uncle didn't want to hear about this, and he was constantly being asked, can you step in? Can you deal with this? Is there some way to make him abdicate and that sort of thing? And it was only when a commission was formed to examine all these things, to look at the debts, to try and work out whether he was actually mentally fit to be king and that sort of thing, that reluctantly the uncle agreed to put the case for abdication. So he then took over, and it was his son who was the last king of Bavaria in 1918, because Otto, as I said, the brother was a hopeless lunatic and survived, I think, until 1913 or so. But, he was not in a state to do anything. So briefly, of course, he took over from his brother and became king, but there was no question that he could rule Bavaria either. So there were members of the family. There was a succession because the uncle, the younger brother of his father, did actually have children himself, and therefore there was a succession. And there are still people today who would be kings of Bavaria if Bavaria was still a monarchy.
Have you met some of these descendants from this family?
I've met Wittelsbachs. It's quite a big family. Everybody in Munich knows the Wittelsbach.
So, of course, we talked some of the legacy of Ludwig II, but what would you say was his real legacy? And we talked about some of this, but just a summary, what would you say is his legacy?
Well, it's an interesting question. I found just completely by accident when I was in Bavaria last year that on the around the time of his death, the anniversary of his death, I was in the woods where on the Starnberg See where he died, taking my little group down to see the little chapel there, which is on the place where he waded out into the water. There's a cross there in the water where he was found. And I found myself, actually, I didn't know this was happening, that there was a mass being held there to celebrate the life of Ludwig II, as there is every year. And therefore, I listened to the speeches that were made by members, I think, of the sort of local Ludwig society that meets there every year. And they came out with all sorts of things about how he stood up for the people, he stood up for the church, what a pious man he was, how conscientious a ruler he was, how he had fostered the trade unions within in Bavaria. There was a whole litany of praise being pronounced about just what a fantastic king he was. Now, obviously, this isn't the most impartial stuff on earth. This would have been the Ludwig II Appreciation Society, with many members of the Wittelsbach family who still live in a little schloss next door, by the way. The Schlossburg, it's called. It's only about 10 minutes walk from where we were. So, and that's where he was imprisoned at the end of his life. So hence the fact that's where he died. And so for Bavarians who are keen Ludwig fans, he leaves an important legacy of being a proper Wittelsbach, a proper Bavarian king who stood up for Bavaria by not giving in to Prussia, which of course he did give in to Prussia, and he received all these bribes from Prussia and that sort of thing, but who actually represented a proud figure in the history of Bavaria. In terms of a legacy that is rather more solid than that, his legacy is the architecture that he left. Now, we have sort of strong views about, how much that architecture has an importance. But this neo-Rococo style, which was important in that it dwelt on the Rococo, which was a Bavarian style in itself, and perhaps better in Bavaria than anywhere else. And these fantastic buildings, which are such a visible monument to his rather tragic reign. But I couldn't say that Ludwig left a political legacy of any importance, other than pinpointing the problems of a man who perhaps lived outside his time, in that he was not prepared to accept constitutional monarchy. If you say after the coronation in this country on Saturday, that we have a figure like King Charles, who cannot represent or freely say what he thinks about his ministers or his governments or anything like that, because he's not allowed to be political. Now, that sort of position for Ludwig was anathema. He hated it. He wanted to rule like Louis XIV. He wanted to be an absolute monarch. And if he couldn't be an absolute monarch, in the end, he didn't want to be a monarch.
We mentioned that Ludwig II came to the throne too soon. I would say rather the opposite is the case for Charles III.
Yes. Well, yeah. He's come rather late to the throne, whereas Ludwig came rather early to the throne. I suppose the best solution is somewhere in the middle, but neither of them perhaps had their ideal time.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you on to talk about Ludwig XIII. But also about the title of this episode is then mentioned this by the way it's called the Swan King, and I haven't asked about this. I've been meaning to before we rounded this up. How did it come to get this title, the Swan King?
Well, it's a reference to the Lohengrin legend. If you know the Wagner opera Lohengrin. At the beginning of Lohengrin, the prince disappears, and because a pre-Christian woman, a witch called Ortrud, has turned him into a swan. And in the end of Lohengrin, the swan returns and retakes the form of the prince, and that's the end of the opera. Now, he was called the Swan King. Even his father, Max, produced this image of the swan, the association of Lohengrin, the legend of Lohengrin, which had been written by this Franconian poet in the Middle Ages, with the kings of Bavaria, because it was meant to be a properly Bavarian tale. And so if you look at Hohenschwangau, the castle built by his father, Max, is an enormous swan on the top of it. Now that, I think, was put there by Ludwig. But in the paintings, of course, in both palaces when he was a little boy, he saw this legend of the swan, and the swan is everywhere in Ludwig's castles. There's always swan decorations, door handles, mirrors with swans on them. It was the image, rather like the Bourbon, rather like the kings of France, even before the Bourbon. There was one sort of Wappentier, the Germans would call it, an animal, armorial animal that represented that particular king. And as far as Ludwig was concerned, it was the swan. But the swan had its origin in Wolfram von Eschenbach's saga of the swan that becomes the opera Lohengrin, and the association, therefore, with the swan, which was, the prince brought back in the form of the swan in order to rule his people.
Was this a nickname given to him during or after his lifetime?
I think probably the association was there during his lifetime because it was very much a Bavarian legend. He grew up with it. He didn't invent these themes that would become Wagnerian operas. They hadn't actually been written as operas yet. They were projects as he was growing up. And of course, he loved to be able to give Wagner money and encouragement in order to write these operas, because he'd been rehearsing them himself with his friends when he was a little boy. And the idea of helping Wagner to realize these operas on these themes was, of course, one of the great excitements of the early years of his monarchy. But sadly for him, the enormous amount of money that Wagner took off him meant that the people of Munich rose up essentially to get Wagner thrown out of Bavaria. So the idea that he was going to carry on funding these wonderful artistic ideas and opera houses and that sort of thing never happened, much to his annoyance. Though he did manage to lend Wagner the money to build Bayreuth, the theatre in Bayreuth, but by that stage, he couldn't give it to him. He had to lend it to him because the parliament in Bavaria would not have allowed it to fully fund the project of the stage for Wagner's operas in Bayreuth.
Again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Before you go, do you have any social media and any links you wanted to put in the description of this episode? Anything you want to promote at all?
No, not really. I mean, you know, you will find me on Twitter. I think I've got you on Twitter, haven't I? No, I think so. Tell them to buy my books. Apart from that, I'm not sure I've got anything to add.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast again. This has been H12. We are available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. If you're an Apple Podcast, consider writing a review of this podcast. If you liked it, that would help us out a lot. Also, check out some of our other episodes. If you like this one, you've definitely got something that you should find that you like. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.